What would you do if the defining feature of your hometown was a puzzle no one had ever dared to solve? For 90 years, a weathered frontier wagon hung impossibly in the highest branches of a giant sentinel pine, a silent testament to some forgotten calamity. Everyone in Elk Hollow had a theory, but no one had the nerve to climb. That is, until 18-year-old Hattie Lorraine Briggs, carrying the weight of a fresh grief and the town's pity, bought 100 feet of hemp rope for $1 she didn't have. But the truth waiting for her in that timber-framed cradle, suspended between earth and sky, was far more than a simple answer to an old riddle. It was a legacy that would change the valley forever. Settle in, and let us know where you're watching from, as we tell the story of the girl who climbed into the past. Hattie Lorraine Briggs returned to Elk Hollow on a Tuesday, the dust of the valley road clinging to the hem of her worn calico dress, like a second morning. She was 18, but her eyes held the flat, quiet sorrow of someone much older. Her father, a logger with hands like gnarled oak and a laugh that could shake pine needles from their branches, was gone, taken by a fever that had swept through the logging camp up north. He had left her with little more than his good name, a well-oiled axe, and a deep-seated stubbornness the townsfolk mistook for foolish pride. She stepped down from the mail wagon, her only luggage a small canvas satchel, and the silence that fell over the main street was thick and heavy. The good people of Elk Hollow looked at her with a mixture of pity and judgment, a girl alone, with no prospects and no family to speak of. She was a problem they didn't know how to solve. She ignored the whispers that followed her, like stray dogs, as she walked toward the mercantile. She felt their eyes on her back, felt the weight of their assumptions. Poor thing. What will she do now? Ought to find a husband. Quick. Her father had taught her to read, to track, to mend what was broken, and to look a man square in the eye. He had not, however, taught her how to bear the quiet condescension of a town that saw her only as a liability. Inside the mercantile, the air smelled of coffee beans, cured leather, and cloves. Mr. Henderson, the proprietor, polished the counter with a rag, his movements slow and deliberate. "Hattie," he said, his voice a low rumble. "Heard about your pa. A good man." She simply nodded, unable to trust her voice. She placed her last few coins on the counter. "Flour," she said, "and salt. And 100 feet of your best hemp rope." Henderson paused, his rag still. He looked at the coins, then at her face. He pushed the flour and salt forward, but left the rope coiled on its spool. "The food is on the house, child. A tribute to your father. But what in God's name do you need with that much rope?" Hattie looked past him, through the dusty window, to the distant silhouette of Sentinel Ridge. High on its slope, a single, massive pine clawed at the sky, and in its upper branches, just a dark speck from here, was the wagon. "I have some climbing to do," she murmured, her voice finally steady. Henderson sighed, a long, weary sound. "That old thing, Hattie, leave it be. Some things are best left as mysteries." But Hattie just gathered her supplies, her gaze fixed on that distant tree. The mystery wasn't the point. The point was that for the first time in her life, there was nothing and no one left to hold her to the ground. Her decision to climb to the Sentinel wagon, as it was known, became the talk of Elk Hollow before she'd even cleared the town limits. It was seen not as an act of courage, but as a symptom of grief-addled madness. A young woman, alone and unmoored, tilting at a 90-year-old windmill made of wood and wonder. The story had been woven into the fabric of the town's identity. Some said a great flood had lifted it there, a freak act of God that had receded and left the wagon stranded. Others whispered of a mad prospector who, driven by gold fever, had tried to build a flying machine. The most common tale, the one told to children to keep them from wandering too far, was that it was a ghost wagon, placed there by spirits as a warning. For 9 decades, it had been a landmark, a conversation piece, a thing to be pointed at from a safe distance. No one had ever seriously considered touching it. It was part of the landscape, as fixed and untouchable as the mountain itself. Hattie's quiet declaration in the mercantile was therefore a kind of sacrilege. It was a disruption of the natural order. The men at the saloon laughed into their beer. "Briggs's girl has lost her senses," one declared. Thinks she's part squirrel now. The women gathered around the church steps after service, shook their heads with grave concern. The poor dear, clucked Mrs. Gable, the preacher's wife. Her father's passing has untethered her mind. We should pray for her. Only one person didn't treat her with mockery or pity. Her father's old friend, a stoic blacksmith named Thomas Finch, met her on the path leading out of town. He didn't offer advice or warnings. He simply pressed a small, heavy bundle into her hands. It was a set of old iron climbing spikes and a sturdy leather harness, smelling of the forge and honest labor. Your pa used these on the big pines, he said, his voice rough but kind. They hold true. It was the only blessing she received. As she walked toward the ridge, the weight of the spikes in her satchel was a comfort, a tangible link to the man who had taught her that the world looked different from high places. The town saw a foolish girl chasing a ghost. Hattie saw the one thing in her life that was still looking up. What was she hoping to find up there? A treasure? An answer? Or was she just trying to climb so high that the grief on the ground couldn't reach her? Let us know in the comments what you think drove her, and be sure to subscribe for more stories of forgotten history. Now, as Hattie reached the base of the ancient tree, the true scale of her task finally settled upon her. The whispers of Elk Hollow faded behind her, replaced by the sound of wind moving through the high country. The town's judgment felt small and distant here, dwarfed by the sheer presence of the mountains. Sheriff Brody, a man whose authority came more from the shine on his badge than any real wisdom, had been the loudest of her detractors. He'd stopped her as she passed the livery stable, his hands on his hips, a smirk playing on his lips. Now, Hattie, he'd said, his voice dripping with condescension. This is a fool's errand. You're gonna get yourself hurt, and then you'll be my problem. Why don't you just go on back to your father's cabin and act sensible? Hattie had met his gaze, her expression unreadable. Being sensible hasn't gotten me very far, Sheriff, she'd replied, her voice quiet but firm, and continued walking without another word. His laughter had followed her, sharp and dismissive. It was the laughter of a man who believed the world contained no mysteries he couldn't measure with a yardstick or lock in a cell. His mockery was a stone in her shoe, but it only strengthened her resolve. Her path took her past the edge of the known territory, where the well-worn trails gave way to game paths and memory. It was here, near a small, clear stream that tumbled over mossy rocks, that she encountered the valley's oldest resident, Silas Blackwood. He was a trapper and a recluse, a man who spoke more to the seasons than to people. He was sitting on a fallen log, mending a snare with thin, practiced fingers. His face was a roadmap of wrinkles, his eyes the color of the winter sky. He watched her approach without surprise, as if he'd been expecting her. He didn't offer a greeting, just a slow nod. Hattie, respecting his silence, nodded back. As she passed, his voice, dry as autumn leaves, rustled behind her. Some things ain't stuck, he said, not looking up from his work. They're planted. The words were strange, nonsensical. Hattie paused, turning them over in her mind. Planted? A wagon couldn't be planted. She glanced back, but Silas was already absorbed in his task, a part of the forest itself. The cryptic phrase settled in her mind, another puzzle piece that didn't fit. She carried it with her as she began the final ascent. The ground growing steeper, the air thinning, the great pine looming ever larger above her. The town's mockery was a goad, the sheriff's scorn a challenge, but the old trapper's words were something else entirely. They were a seed. The journey to the base of the sentinel pine took the better part of the day. The sun, a pale coin in the vast blue sky, moved slowly across the heavens as Hattie climbed, leaving the last vestiges of Elk Hollow far below. The world shrank to the rhythm of her own breathing and the crunch of pine needles under her boots. The air grew cooler, cleaner, scented with resin and damp earth. When she finally stood before it, she had to crane her neck back so far she nearly lost her balance. The tree was a giant, a creature from an older, wilder world. Its trunk was wider than a wagon was long, the bark a thick, furrowed armor of red-brown plates. Its lowest branches were 30 feet above her head, thick as a grown man's waist, and far, far above that, nestled in a cradle of immense limbs, sat the wagon. It was smaller than she'd imagined, a toy left behind by a giant child. Weather-beaten and skeletal, its canvas long since rotted away, it listed at a precarious angle. It looked both impossibly fragile and stubbornly permanent. That first evening, she didn't try to climb. She simply made a small, neat camp at the base of the tree, laying out her bedroll and starting a modest fire. The sun set in a blaze of orange and violet, casting long, distorted shadows that made the forest seem alive and watchful. As twilight deepened into night, the stars emerged, cold and brilliant in the clear mountain air. Hattie sat with her back against the immense trunk, feeling the ancient, living wood against her spine. She could feel a faint, slow vibration through the bark, the life of the tree itself, drawing water from the deep earth and reaching for the sky. The silence was profound. There was no jeering, no pity, no expectation. There was only the whisper of the wind in the high branches, a sound like a distant ocean. She listened. She imagined the stories the tree could tell, the seasons it had witnessed, the secrets it held in its woody heart. In the flickering firelight, the wagon above seemed less like a wreck and more like a nest, a strange, man-made fruit hanging from a mythical bough. Disappointment, which she had half expected to feel, was absent. Instead, a quiet sense of purpose settled over her. She wasn't here to conquer the tree, but to ask its permission. She slept there, under its protection, the first person in 90 years to spend a night in its shadow, listening to the slow, patient language of the mountain. A single question echoed in her mind before sleep took her. How could something so heavy have been lifted so high without breaking a single major branch? The first clue was not in the sky, but on the ground. Hattie spent the next morning circling the base of the sentinel pine, her eyes scanning not up, but down. She was looking for signs, for the scars of history. If a great flood had swept through, as the most popular legend claimed, the surrounding terrain should show evidence of it. Scoured rock, displaced soil, a different pattern of vegetation. But the forest floor here was ancient and undisturbed. A thick carpet of pine needles, decades deep, cushioned her steps. Moss, thick and green as velvet, grew in a uniform blanket over the rocks and roots. Everything spoke of slow, uninterrupted growth. The flood theory began to unravel in her mind. It was a good story, dramatic and simple, but the land itself denied it. Then she saw it. On the north side of the trunk, sheltered from the harshest weather, was a patch of moss, unlike any other in the valley. It was a pale, silvery green, with a delicate, almost feathery texture. She recognized it from one of her father's old books on botany. It was a species that grew only at much higher elevations, in the thin, cold air near the timberline, miles away and thousands of feet higher up the mountain. It made no sense. How could a patch of high-altitude moss be growing here? She ran her fingers over it. It was thriving, clinging to the furrows of the bark. Her gaze followed the line of the trunk upward. Directly above the strange moss, almost too faint to see, was a series of unnatural-looking scars in the bark. They weren't the random gashes of a lightning strike, or the claw marks of a bear. They were spaced at regular intervals, climbing the trunk in a subtle, vertical line. A ladder. Not a ladder of wood, but a ladder of wounds, long since healed over, but still visible to a trained eye. Her father had taught her to read the stories trees told through their scars. This tree was telling a story of a slow, methodical ascent. Someone had climbed this tree long ago, not with brute force, but with patience. The moss, she realized, must have been transported here, perhaps on the boots or equipment of that long-ago climber. A tiny, living clue left behind. It was a ghost of a footprint from a man who had come down from the high peaks. This wasn't the site of a single, violent event. This was the site of a deliberate, long-term project. The puzzle was shifting. The question was no longer just how the wagon got up there, but who had possessed the skill, the patience, and the reason to put it there. The mockery of the town, felt a universe away. She was no longer a grieving girl on a fool's errand. She was an investigator, and the silent, towering pine was her only witness. The time for observation was over. The time for labor had begun. Hattie uncoiled the 100 feet of hemp rope. Its clean, fibrous smell, a promise of connection between the grounds and the sky. She tied a heavy stone to one end, and, after several patient attempts, managed to swing it high enough to catch in the crook of the first massive branch, a good 30 feet up. She pulled on it, testing its hold, her entire body weight hanging from the line. It held firm. The first rung of her ladder was in place. Then came the spikes from Thomas Finch, cold and heavy in her hands. She strapped on the leather harness, its worn familiarity a comfort. This was work her father would have understood. The first few spikes were the hardest, driven into the thick, resistant bark, with a small hammer from her satchel. Each strike echoed in the quiet forest. It felt like a violation, wounding this ancient being, and she whispered a quiet apology to the tree with each blow. Once the first spike was secure, she looped a safety line from her harness and began her ascent. It was slow, grueling work. Climb a few feet, find a secure hold, hammer in another spike. The rope was a guide, but the real work was done by her own strength, her fingers and boots finding purchase in the rough landscape of the bark. Hours passed. The sun climbed higher, filtering through the dense canopy in shifting patterns of light. Her world shrank to the few feet of trunk in front of her face. The smell of pine resin was sharp and clean. Her muscles burned, her hands grew raw. But a steady, calm rhythm took over. This was a language she knew, the language of physical effort, of problem-solving, of moving steadily toward a goal. She was not just climbing a tree, she was climbing out of the fog of her grief, one foothold at a time. The memory of her father was with her in the sure grip of her hands, in the knowledge of knots he had taught her, in the quiet determination that had been his defining characteristic. As she climbed higher, the forest floor receded, the familiar world giving way to a new perspective. She could see over the surrounding treetops, to the ridges and valleys beyond. The town of Elk Hollow was just a smudge of smoke in the distance. Up here, the wind was a constant companion, a living presence that pushed and pulled at her, testing her balance. She finally reached the level of the wagon, her heart pounding, not just from exertion, but from anticipation. It was even more weathered up close, the wood bleached silver by sun and scoured by wind. An axle was broken, and one wheel hung askew, but it was otherwise remarkably intact, held fast in a web of thick branches that had grown around it, embracing it, making it part of the tree itself. It wasn't just stuck, it was woven into the very fabric of the pine. She had one final, difficult maneuver, pulling herself over the last branch and onto the tilting floor of the wagon bed. And there, breathing heavily in the thin mountain air, she stood where no one had stood for 90 years. The floor of the wagon bed was covered in a thick layer of decomposed pine needles and dust, a miniature forest floor 90 feet in the air. For a moment, Hattie simply stood, catching her breath, taking in the impossible view. The world spread out below her like a map. She felt a dizzying sense of accomplishment, a quiet triumph that had nothing to do with the town and everything to do with herself. Then, her eyes began to search. There was no treasure chest, no pile of gold dust, no human remains. There was just the skeletal frame of the wagon, a few rotted leather straps, and the debris of the decades. But in the corner, protected from the worst of the elements by the high, curved side of the wagon, was a small, unassuming tin box, the kind used for keeping documents or tea. It was rusted shut, but heavy. Her heart beat a little faster. This was it. This was the story. She worked at the lid with the tip of her knife, the rusted metal groaning in protest. Finally, with a sharp crack, it gave way. Inside, nestled in what was once oilcloth, was a leather-bound journal, its cover stiff and warped, but its pages miraculously preserved by the dry, airy conditions. There was also a small canvas satchel, and when she opened it, she found it filled not with gold, but with seeds. Dozens of small, carefully labeled packets containing seeds of plants she'd never seen before. Hardy, high-altitude grains, strange mountain vegetables, and the seeds of that same silvery green moss she had seen at the base of the tree. The last item in the box was a single, tarnished silver locket. She opened it carefully. On one side was a faded tintype of a woman with kind eyes, and on the other, a name was delicately engraved in swirling script. Annalise. Hattie opened the journal. The handwriting was neat and precise. The ink faded, but still legible. The first page read, Elias Thorne, his Arboretum. Year 1, 1878. Elias Thorne. The name was unfamiliar, not one known in the valley's lore. She began to read, the wind turning the pages for her. Elias was not a prospector or a madman. He was a botanist, an idealist. He believed the valley floor was becoming overlogged and overfarmed. He had a vision of a new kind of agriculture, one that worked with the mountains instead of against them. He was creating a high-altitude arboretum, a garden in the sky, using this giant pine as his base of operations. The wagon wasn't stranded. It was a workshop, a seed bank, a scientific outpost. He had spent years hauling it up, piece by piece, using a complex system of ropes and pulleys, reassembling it on the branches he had carefully reinforced. He was planting a future for the valley. The last entry was dated in late autumn. The first winter rye has taken hold on the north slope. Annalise will be proud. I will go down to meet her in the spring. We will build our home amongst the giants. There was no spring entry. Just as Hattie finished reading the final, hopeful sentence in Elias Thorne's journal, the sky, which had been a brilliant, clear blue, began to change. Dark, bruised-looking clouds boiled up over the western ridge with an alarming speed, and the wind, once a steady whisper, began to howl through the branches, carrying the cold scent of rain. A mountain storm. She had been so engrossed in the journal that she hadn't noticed the warning signs. The tree began to sway, not gently, but in long, groaning arcs that made the old wagon creak in protest. Hattie quickly and carefully wrapped the journal and the seed packets in her own oilcloth, stowing them securely in her satchel. This was more precious than gold. It was a man's life, his dream. She had to protect it. The first drops of rain, cold and heavy as lead pellets, began to fall. The storm broke with a terrifying fury. Lightning spiderwebbed across the sky, followed by immediate, deafening cracks of thunder that seemed to shake the very bones of the mountain. The rain came down in a solid, blinding sheet. Her descent would be impossible, suicidal, in these conditions. The rope would be slick, the bark treacherous. She had no choice but to ride out the storm in the swaying wagon, clinging to the wooden sides as the sentinel pine thrashed in the gale. It was in a brief, blinding flash of lightning that she saw a small flicker of movement on the forest floor far below. It was a child, a little girl, no older than 7, lost and terrified, stumbling through the woods, her calico dress soaked through. Hattie recognized her instantly. Abigail, the baker's youngest daughter, a curious wanderer. She must have strayed too far from a family picnic. Hattie's heart seized. The girl would never survive the storm alone. Cupping her hands to her mouth, Hattie shouted down, her voice ripped away by the wind. But she kept shouting, again and again. Here! Up here! Shelter! At the base of the tree! Miraculously, through a lull in the wind, the child heard her. She looked up, her small face a pale oval of fear, and scrambled toward the relative safety of the massive trunk. Hattie watched, her own fear forgotten, coaching the girl from above, telling her to huddle in a hollow between 2 large roots. For the next hour, as the storm raged, Hattie was no longer just the keeper of a lost story. She was a guardian, a sentinel herself, her presence a small beacon of hope for the terrified child below. When the storm finally passed, leaving a world washed clean and dripping, she knew her task had changed. It wasn't enough to bring a story back to Elk Hollow. She had to bring back one of its own. The descent was slow and treacherous. The bark was slick with rain, and every handhold had to be tested. When Hattie finally reached the ground, her muscles screaming with fatigue, little Abigail rushed into her arms, sobbing with relief and exhaustion. Hattie wrapped the girl in her spare blanket, murmuring soothing words, and shared the last of her water. They started the long walk back to Elk Hollow as the late afternoon sun broke through the clouds, steaming the moisture from the forest floor. They arrived at the edge of town just as dusk was settling, painting the sky in soft shades of pink and gray. The sight of them, the strange pair, the wild-looking girl and the lost child, sent a ripple through the town. Abigail's mother, frantic with worry, ran from the bakery, her cries of relief echoing down the main street. She swept her daughter into her arms, then turned to Hattie, her eyes full of a gratitude so profound it needed no words. The search party, led by a grim-faced Sheriff Brody, stopped in its tracks. The townspeople emerged from their homes and shops, their faces a mixture of astonishment and dawning respect. The next morning, Hattie walked to the town clerk's office. Mr. Abernathy, a kind, scholarly man with spectacles perched on his nose, was the keeper of the town's records. She placed the leather-bound journal on his desk. "I believe this belongs in the town's history," she said quietly. Mr. Abernathy opened it with reverent hands. He read for a long time, his expression shifting from curiosity to awe. He cross-referenced the name, Elias Thorne, in his dusty ledgers. "My word," he breathed, looking up at Hattie over his glasses. "It's true. A deed was filed in 1877 for the entire north slope of Sentinel Ridge, to a botanist from the east. The records say he was lost in the Great Flood of '78, presumed dead while trying to reach his claim. He wasn't in the flood," Hattie said. "He was above it." The story spread through Elk Hollow like a slow, warming fire. The wagon wasn't a monument to a disaster, but to a dream. Elias Thorne wasn't a madman. He was a visionary. The townspeople looked at the Sentinel Pine with new eyes. Sheriff Brody watched from a distance, his usual smirk gone, replaced by a look of grudging respect. He never mentioned her fool's errand again. The mockery had vanished, replaced by a quiet reverence. Not just for the man who had planted a garden in the sky, but for the young woman who had been brave enough to climb up and find it. People started arriving from neighboring valleys, not to gawk at an oddity, but to pay homage to a piece of history Hattie had brought back to life. A week later, at golden hour, Hattie stood once more at the base of the Sentinel Pine. The air was calm, the light soft and forgiving. She wasn't alone. Thomas Finch was there, and Mr. Abernathy, and even Abigail's family, who had brought a small basket of fresh bread. A small crowd of townspeople stood at a respectful distance, watching. In her hand, Hattie held one of the small seed packets from Elias Thorne's tin box. The label, written in his neat script, read, "Mountain Fireweed." Mr. Abernathy had explained that the Great Flood of '78 had not been a single event, but the result of a massive landslide upriver, caused by aggressive logging that had destabilized the slopes. Elias Thorne had seen it coming. His arboretum wasn't just a project, it was an answer. He was planting species that would hold the soil, that would prevent the very disaster that had likely taken his life, before he could warn anyone, before he could meet his Annalise in the spring. Hattie knelt down and, using her father's trowel, dug a small hole in the rich earth at the base of the tree. She poured the tiny, feathery seeds into the soil and gently covered them. She looked up at the wagon, a dark silhouette against the glowing sky. It wasn't a wreck anymore. It was a promise. Mrs. Gable, the preacher's wife, approached her quietly. "What he built up there," she murmured, her voice full of wonder. It's a monument." Hattie stood up, brushing the dirt from her hands, and looked not at the wagon, but at the earth where the seeds now lay. "No," she said, her voice clear and steady in the evening air. "It's not a monument. It's a garden waiting for a gardener. Thank you for staying with us to the end of Hattie's incredible journey." Her story reminds us that a legacy isn't something you inherit, but something you climb toward. If you were moved by her courage, please give this story a like and let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Be sure to subscribe so you don't miss our next tale from the forgotten corners of history.